The storm caught us by surprise. The plan was simple: a quick hike through the mountains, a night under the stars, and back to the city the next day. But as always, the mountains have their own rules, and we were reminded of that with the first clap of thunder that shook the sky. Greg, me, and our three other friends, Jenny, Lucas, and Sarah, knew we had no choice. We had to find shelter, and fast. The rain started falling like a thick curtain, and the cold wind cut through our skin. Fortunately, we found an old cabin abandoned on the edge of the trail. It looked like a place forgotten by time, with rotting wood and windows that barely held against the wind. Without hesitation, we ran inside, grateful to be out of the relentless storm. Inside, the smell of mold and old wood filled the air. The place was simple: a main room with a fireplace that hadn't seen fire in years, an old table, and creaky chairs that groaned with every movement. But what caught our attention the most were the signs of abandonment. Water stains on the floor, a thick layer of dust, and strangest of all, a heavy sense of emptiness. We were alone, or at least that's what we thought. We sat by the fireplace, trying to warm ourselves as the thunder rumbled in the distance. Greg tried to use his phone, but we were too far out to get a signal. The storm outside was fierce, and the gusts of wind made the trees outside bend. The feeling of isolation was complete. We started talking about trivial things, trying to ignore the discomfort growing with the storm's noise. That's when we heard it. 3 knocks, sharp and quick, at the front door. All of us froze. We fell silent, exchanging confused looks. Who would be out there in the middle of a storm like this? It must be other hikers looking for shelter, Lucas suggested, but the lack of certainty in his voice was clear. No one got up to open the door. For a long minute, the only sound was the rain filling the silence. And then once again, the knocks came. Greg was the first to get up, visibly unsettled. He walked to the door with the flashlight and looked through the side window. "There's no one there," he said, his face puzzled. But before we could process what that meant, he opened the door. The wind and rain rushed into the cabin, but outside there was absolutely nothing, no person, no sign of movement. Even stranger, there were no footprints in the fresh mud in front of the door. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah whispered, visibly frightened. We shut the door tightly, locking it, though we weren't sure what we were trying to protect ourselves from. We all sat back down, but the atmosphere was heavy, as if something was watching us. The tension only grew when the knocking returned, but this time it didn't come from the door. The sound echoed from the walls, the ceiling, and then distinctly from inside the cabin. I felt my stomach turn. The feeling that we weren't alone became unbearable. Lucas, trying to stay calm, suggested that maybe the house was too old, creaking in the wind. But none of us really believed that. The knocks were too rhythmic, too intentional. It was as if something or someone was trying to warn us that we were in their territory. Suddenly, the fireplace, which had been cold and covered in old ashes, crackled, as if something had been thrown into it. Jenny screamed, pointing at the fireplace. The ashes swirled, forming small eddies, as if something invisible was stirring them. The fear in her eyes mirrored what we were all feeling. Something was with us. Then the knocks grew more intense, and the sound echoed from every direction. We felt like the walls were closing in. And worse, the sound was coming from inside. It was Greg who made the decision. "We need to get out of here now." We grabbed our things in a hurry, and without caring about the storm outside, we ran out of the cabin as fast as we could. We ran through the rain, the wind slashing at our faces, but the fear of staying was far greater than the discomfort of the storm. When we finally got far enough away, I looked back. The cabin was still there, motionless, but it felt like something or someone was watching us from the window. The lightning briefly illuminated the silhouette of a figure in the corner of the room before everything disappeared again into the darkness. We never returned to that trail. And to this day, when I think of those knocks and what might have been in that cabin, a chill runs down my spine. Some doors I realized should never be opened. It was a weekend that Jessica and I had been planning for months. We found an isolated cabin in the mountains of Vermont, far from everything, to spend 2 days away from the city. When we arrived, the place was even more beautiful than in the photos, surrounded by dense forest, with a stunning view of the pine-covered mountains. But as soon as we parked the car and got out, we noticed that the weather wasn't on our side. The sky, once clear, began to darken with threatening clouds, and a cold breeze blew through the area. By early afternoon, a violent storm broke over the cabin. The rain fell heavily, hammering the roof and windows, while the thunder shook the ground. Inside, the fire in the fireplace kept us warm, and despite the storm's intensity, we were comfortable. We opened a bottle of wine, sat on the couch, and just watched the rain through the window. The feeling of being away from everything, just the two of us, was liberating. However, what seemed like a peaceful refuge would soon turn into something unsettling. A little after 8 in the evening, amidst the sound of the rain and thunder, we heard something strange. Voices. They were coming from somewhere in the dense forest surrounding the cabin. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but Jessica heard it too. The voices were low, indistinct, but definitely human. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere, and who else would be out here during such a storm? Curious but apprehensive, we turned off the inside lights so as not to draw attention and stepped onto the porch to try and listen more closely. That's when we saw someone. A few meters from the tree line, there was a figure. It was hard to tell who or what it was with all the rain, but they were just standing there, watching the cabin. My heart raced. Jessica gripped my arm tightly, and without thinking twice, we went back inside and locked the door. The sense of safety we had felt just minutes before vanished completely. There was no cell signal in the area, and the local radio picked up nothing but static. We were completely isolated. The silence inside the cabin was soon broken by a noise that made me freeze. The door handle began to turn slowly. Someone was trying to get in. I rushed to the door, pressing my weight against it, while Jessica, pale with fear, held onto my arm. For a moment, everything went quiet again, but then we heard heavy footsteps outside, circling the house. I ran to the window, and through the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Faces. 2 or 3 faces were pressed against the glass, as if they were trying to see what was inside. Without thinking much, I went to the closet where the cabin owner had mentioned he kept a hunting rifle. I'm not the kind of person who likes guns, but at that moment, it seemed like our only defense. I grabbed the rifle, unlocked it with trembling hands, and returned to the living room. Jessica was in a panic, and I could hear the intruders moving around the cabin, murmuring things we couldn't understand. Opening a crack in the living room window, I aimed the gun upwards and fired a shot into the air, the deafening sound echoing through the forest. The silence that followed was almost as disturbing as the previous noises. We didn't hear any more footsteps. The voices disappeared. It seemed like the shot had scared them off. We stood there, motionless, listening only to the sound of the rain and thunder, unsure if they would return. The rest of the night was a nightmare. We barely slept, listening for any noise, any sign that we weren't alone. When morning finally came, we left the cabin as quickly as we could. The place looked the same, except for some footprints around the house, partially washed away by the rain. Nothing was damaged, and there were no more signs that anyone had been there. As we drove back to the city, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it just been some people trying to scare us? Or did they really want to break into the cabin? We'll never know. But one thing is certain, we will never return to that cabin again. That night, in the storm, made us realize how vulnerable we are when the unknown decides to come close. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a break from the stress of the city. My friends, Matt, Karen, Lucas, and Sam, and I rented a remote cabin in the Oregon mountains, with a lake just a few meters away, and surrounded by a dense forest. The weather forecast predicted rain, but we didn't care. In fact, the idea of staying in a cabin with a fire burning and the sound of a storm in the background seemed cozy. Little did we know that the storm would bring something that would forever change our sense of safety. The storm began on Saturday afternoon, slowly at first, with light drizzle and the sky darkening. By around 9 at night, the rain had turned into a full-blown downpour. Lightning streaked across the sky, and the wind made the trees around the cabin creak as if they were about to give way at any moment. Despite the scene, we were trying to keep things light. We played cards and chatted until the power suddenly went out. We were plunged into total darkness, with only the dim glow of the fireplace and a few candles to guide us. That's when the unease began to grow. The first strange sound came from outside, muffled by the storm, but distinct enough to catch our attention. It sounded like something moving among the trees near the cabin. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but the sound was different, more rhythmic, like footsteps crunching on dry branches. "Did you hear that?" Karen asked, her eyes wide. Matt grabbed a flashlight and approached the window, trying to see what was out there, but the rain was so heavy that everything looked like a blur. We decided to ignore the noise, convinced it was an animal or just our imagination. But then, shortly after midnight, there was a knock at the door. 3 quick, sharp knocks that made all of us freeze in place. We looked at each other, hoping someone would know what to do. Matt, always the bravest, was the first to stand up, flashlight in hand. He walked slowly to the door. When he opened it, the sight outside made us even more uneasy. There was no one there. The rain continued to pour down, and the only thing Matt found was the emptiness of the night. "It must have been the wind," he said, trying to sound confident, but his voice betrayed the growing tension we all felt. We locked the door and returned to the fireplace, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Not long after, Sam went to the bathroom, and when he came back, he was pale. "There's someone out there," he said, his voice trembling. "I saw a person. They were standing by the lake just watching me." The idea of someone being out there, in the middle of such a storm, was too frightening to ignore. We ran to the window, but we couldn't see anything beyond the darkness and the relentless rain. Sam insisted he had seen someone, and his fear was so genuine that none of us could dismiss it. What else could we do? Going outside to investigate was out of the question, so we locked all the doors and windows and decided to wait until dawn. It was one of the longest nights of my life. The cabin creaked with the wind, and the sound of the rain seemed to grow louder with every passing minute. Around 3 in the morning, when we thought things couldn't get any worse, we heard another noise. Something was scraping along the outside of the cabin, dragging against the wooden walls. It was a repetitive, slow, deliberate sound. I was paralyzed, unable to move as I listened to that terrifying sound. Lucas grabbed the flashlight, but none of us dared to go outside or even approach the door. We just sat there in silence, hoping it would stop. When morning finally came, the storm had calmed, but none of us felt relieved. We went outside to check the area around the cabin, and what we found only reinforced our worst fears. There were deep marks on the door, as if someone had tried to break it down during the night. The wood was scratched, with long, uneven cuts, like something had been dragged repeatedly against it. The most disturbing part was that around the cabin, there were deep footprints in the mud, leading toward the lake, exactly where Sam had seen the mysterious figure. Without saying a word, we all knew it was time to leave. We packed our things in silence and left soon after, without looking back. As we drove back to the city, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was some vandal, or even a wild animal. But the feeling that something darker had been watching us that night never completely went away. To this day, when the weather turns and a strong storm approaches, I can't help but remember that night in the cabin. The scratches on the door, the strange sounds, and the figure standing by the lake continue to haunt our memories. If you're enjoying the stories so far, Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. The storm that hit our town that night was one of the worst I've ever seen. Violent winds and thunder rattled the windows, while the trees around our house swayed as if they were made of paper. We were all gathered in the living room, my parents, my younger sister, and me, trying to pass the time until the storm died down. Little did we know that night would reveal something we could never have imagined. Around 11 o'clock, a deafening crash shook the house. The sound was so loud and unexpected that for a moment, we all froze in place. The ground shook, and that's when we realized what had happened. One of the huge trees in the yard hadn't withstood the wind's force and had fallen directly onto our house. The living room roof was crushed, parts of it collapsing and scattering pieces of wood, tiles, and leaves everywhere. My mother screamed, pulling my sister away from the debris, while my father tried to assess the damage. We ran outside, into the rain, trying to get a better look. The tree had speared through the roof like a lance, destroying a large part of the structure. It was a scene of chaos, with branches sticking through the house and rainwater starting to seep in. We called the electric company and the fire department, who quickly arrived to assess the situation and cut off the power. Once they ensured there was no immediate danger, we went back inside to start cleaning up what we could. As my father removed smaller branches and pieces of wood scattered across the living room, something strange happened. While removing part of the floor that had been damaged by the fallen tree, he noticed something unusual. There was a space under the floor, something that shouldn't have been there. Instead of the solid wooden floor we had always known, a small opening began to appear. Curious and scared, we started clearing away the damaged flooring around it, revealing a wooden hatch like a hidden door. What we found underneath was something we had never imagined. There was a secret room, hidden beneath the living room floor. It was small, just enough for one person to squeeze inside, with a low ceiling and damp concrete walls. Inside, old objects were piled in dark corners, covered in dust and forgotten over time. My mother suggested we call the police immediately, but curiosity got the best of us. We turned on a flashlight and began to investigate what was in there. The first thing that caught our attention was an old wooden box, rusty hinges barely holding it together. When we opened it, we found a collection of knives. Old knives, all rusted, with blades worn down by time. But the most disturbing discovery came next. Beside the knives was a stack of old photographs, some so deteriorated that it was hard to make out the images. But the ones that were better preserved were horrifying. They were photos of people, but all the faces had been torn or scratched out. The marks were brutal, as if someone had deliberately tried to destroy the identities of the people in the photos. Something was deeply wrong with that place. At that point, the discomfort took over all of us. My father called the police, and before long, officers arrived at our house, inspecting the hidden room and taking the objects for analysis. They searched the area with flashlights, taking photos and asking about the history of the house. But we didn't know anything. The house had been in our family for generations, and never, not even my grandfather, had mentioned the existence of that secret room. The following days were filled with mystery and uncertainty. The police seemed as perplexed as we were. The knives, the photos, and even the room itself, everything was an enigma. Despite their investigations, no concrete information emerged about who had built that space or left those objects there. We asked older neighbors, who also didn't know anything beyond vague rumors about the house being strange, but nothing specific. The discovery began to weigh on all of us. My sister had frequent nightmares about the photos and the room, and I myself started to feel uncomfortable in our own house. It was as if the place was charged with the energy of something dark, something that had been hidden for a reason. The storm, which had brought destruction, had also revealed a secret that maybe should have remained buried. The police eventually stopped investigating, classifying the case as inconclusive. No clues about the origin of the room or the objects were found, and the mystery remained unsolved. We tried to move on, but it was hard to forget what we had seen. Every time I walk through the living room, I can't help but think that, beneath our feet, there's a place that holds a dark secret. A place that, for some reason, had been hidden for so long. To this day, we never found out what really happened in that house. And maybe it's better that way. I was 11 years old at the time, and the idea of staying home alone didn't scare me much. My parents went out to dinner with some friends and wouldn't be back until late. It was a Friday, and all I wanted was to spend the night playing video games without interruptions. Outside, a storm was beginning to form. The rain beat hard against the windows, and occasional thunder echoed in the distance, but I barely noticed. I was focused on my game, headphones covering any noise from the storm. Around 9 o'clock, something unexpected happened. The doorbell rang. I looked at the door, my heart racing. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my parents hadn't mentioned any visitors. The rain was still pouring down, and for a moment I thought it might be a mistake. I paused the game and silently went to the living room, trying not to make any noise. I peeked through the curtain, and there he was, a strange-looking man, drenched from head to toe. He looked a bit lost, his face partially hidden by the hood of his coat. He knocked on the door again and then said something. With the sound of the rain, it was hard to understand, but it seemed like he was asking to use the phone. Logic told me that opening the door was a terrible idea. Who goes out in the middle of a storm, knocking on strangers' doors at night? I decided to ignore him. I waited a few minutes and, with relief, noticed that he had left. I went back to the game, trying to calm my nerves, but I couldn't concentrate anymore. I had the feeling that something was still wrong. About half an hour later, I heard a different noise. A sound coming from the back of the house, as if something had been moved. My house had a back door that led to the kitchen, and when I approached to check, dread overtook me. The door was slightly ajar. That door was always locked. I was sure of it. And worse yet, there were wet footprints on the kitchen floor. My entire body froze. The man hadn't just come back, he had somehow gotten inside. I could barely think. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the guest room, the only one with a decent lock. On the other side of the door, I could hear slow, heavy footsteps, as if he were exploring the house, maybe looking for me. My heart was pounding so fast it seemed like he could hear it. I grabbed my cell phone and tried to call my parents, but the signal was terrible because of the storm. I was alone. Minutes passed like hours. The intruder began fiddling with the doorknob of the room, trying to open it. Panic overtook me. He knew I was in there. I could hear his heavy breathing, murmuring something incomprehensible from the other side. At that moment, my mind worked fast. If I didn't get out soon, he would manage to get in. I remembered that the garage was right next to the guest room, and from the garage, I had direct access to the street. Waiting for the right moment, when the sound of footsteps moved away a little, I unlocked the door and ran. I sprinted through the garage as fast as I could, without even looking back. I opened the garage door and ran outside, feeling the cold rain hit me as I dashed to the neighbor's house. I arrived at their door completely soaked, banging desperately until they answered. The police arrived quickly after my neighbors called. They went into my house and found the man still inside, babbling incoherently. When they arrested him, he kept insisting that I was his son, that he had come to take me back. The situation was so surreal that, even after he was taken away by the police, I couldn't fully understand what had just happened. Later, my parents came home, terrified to hear what had happened. The man, as we found out later, was in a confused mental state, probably due to some substance or condition. He was charged with trespassing and taken into custody. Fortunately, he didn't hurt me, but that night changed the way I saw the safety of my own home. Since then, whenever there's a storm and I'm alone, I remember that man standing in the rain, and I feel grateful that I had the luck to escape unharmed. It was one of those nights where you just want to get home and hide from the rain. The storm seemed to get worse by the minute, with the sky lit up by lightning and the sound of thunder shaking everything around. I was driving back to my apartment, gripping the steering wheel tightly, struggling to see through the downpour that streamed across the windshield. The rain was so intense that my wipers could barely keep up. All I could think about was how to get out of the car without getting soaked, but the storm was relentless. When I finally arrived at the parking lot of my building, I looked up and saw the rain pounding against the asphalt like tiny bullets of water. I didn't have an umbrella with me, and the thought of running to the entrance seemed like a terrible idea. I decided to wait a little in the car, hoping the rain would let up, even for just a few minutes. It was the perfect excuse not to face that downpour. While the constant sound of rain muffled all other noises, something caught my attention. My eyes drifted to the building's entrance, and that's when I saw them. Two men leaving my apartment. They were carrying boxes and bags, and immediately a chill ran down my spine. Those weren't neighbors, and they definitely weren't my friends. What the hell were they doing with my things? My first reaction was to freeze. I felt my heart race, and the sound of the rain seemed to disappear around me. I wanted to get out of the car and yell, confront them, but something inside me held me back. Instead, I instinctively grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. "They're robbing my apartment," I whispered, trying not to draw attention to myself. The police arrived faster than I expected. They surrounded the building and, to my relief, managed to catch the two men before they could escape with everything they had stolen. I watched from afar as the officers handcuffed and searched them. When one of the officers came to speak with me, he said something that sent chills down my spine. The men were armed with knives. And that wasn't all. When they were identified, it was discovered that they had been involved in a series of recent burglaries in the area, including a brutal attack on an elderly man who lived just a few blocks away. That's when I realized how close I had been to something far more dangerous. If I had gotten out of the car and entered the apartment just a few minutes earlier, I would have run into them. Who knows what could have happened? The decision to wait in the car just to avoid getting wet ended up saving me from a potential attack. I had never felt so vulnerable, so close to something that could have been tragic. That night, after everything had calmed down, I finally returned to my apartment. The police told me I was lucky, and they were right. My belongings were recovered, and the damage was minimal, but the feeling of insecurity lingered for a long time. I spent the following week replaying that moment, wondering what would have happened if I had acted differently. Now, every time a strong storm approaches, I can't help but think about that night. What seemed like a simple inconvenience, waiting for the rain to pass, ended up protecting me from something much worse. Maybe, in the end, that storm wasn't a sign of bad luck, but of good fortune. I've always liked storms. The sound of rain on the roof, the distant rumble of thunder, it gave me a strange sense of comfort. But that night, the storm felt different, almost oppressive. The lightning flashed across the sky more frequently than usual, lighting up the yard in sudden bursts. I was alone at home, sitting in the living room with the lights off, letting the storm be the only sound that filled the room. It was during one of those lightning flashes that I noticed something unusual. For a fraction of a second, as the sky lit up, I saw a figure in the yard. I couldn't make out many details, just a motionless silhouette, almost camouflaged by the darkness. I blinked, trying to adjust my vision in the dim light, but the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there, frozen, staring at the window, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was my imagination, a reflection from a tree, or a strange effect caused by the lightning. However, before I could convince myself that nothing was wrong, I heard 3 firm knocks on the front door. My heart jumped. I immediately looked down the hallway. expecting to see the shadow of someone moving past the door's glass. But everything was quiet. A shiver ran down my spine. Who would be knocking at the door in the middle of a storm like this? I hesitated, wondering what to do. Was it a neighbor? Someone asking for help? With trembling hands, I walked to the door. I slowly opened it, the sound of the hinges almost blending with the wind outside. But there was no one there. The rain was coming down hard, forming puddles on the porch, but there was no sign of a person or even footprints. I quickly shut the door, my heart pounding, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Something was wrong. Returning to the living room, I decided to peek out the window again. Another lightning flash lit up the sky, and my blood ran cold. The figure was there again, but this time standing in the street, right in front of my house. Even with the rain, I could see that it was standing still, facing directly toward me. It didn't move. I felt an overwhelming instinct to turn off the lights, to hide, but I couldn't take my eyes off that silhouette. Who was it? What did they want? I stayed there, waiting, trying to understand. Another flash of lightning, and this time, the figure began to move. Slowly, but directly toward me. Panic gripped me, and the urge to run hit me hard. Within seconds, I hid behind the couch, peeking out from the window. I heard the sound of the rain intensifying, the wind howling even louder. With each flash of lightning, I expected to see the figure closer. But then, it disappeared again into the storm's darkness, as if it had never been there. I sat on the floor, breathing heavily, my eyes fixed on the window, too scared to move. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who or what I had just seen. I spent the rest of the night awake, waiting for the sound of more knocks or any sign that the figure might return. But there were no more noises, and eventually, the storm began to pass. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I never saw that figure again, but every time a storm approaches, the memory of that figure in the street, watching, comes back strongly. And no matter how much I try to convince myself that it was just my imagination, a part of me never fully believes it. Because deep down, I know something was there. Something the storm's darkness brought, and that the lightning's light allowed me to see. Even if only for brief moments. I always liked the peace of living in a house away from everything, surrounded by trees. After a long day, nothing relaxed me more than the sound of rain hitting the roof, especially during a storm. That night, the forecast had warned of a severe storm sweeping through the entire region. I was alone at home, enjoying the sound of the rain while reading a book in the living room. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind made the trees in the yard sway violently, but nothing out of the ordinary for that time of year. Around 9 o'clock, I heard a noise that snapped me out of my peace. Something different from the storm sounds. It was a metallic sound like something had been knocked over outside. The noise came from the back window that faced the yard. My first thought was that the wind might have knocked over a tool or a garden chair. But, just to be safe, I decided to check. I grabbed my phone and, with my heart beating a little faster, approached the window, trying to see through the rain-blurred glass. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing in the yard, under a tree. The porch light illuminated only part of his body, but I could clearly see that he was watching me. He wasn't moving. I stood there, frozen for a few seconds, processing what I was seeing. It was hard to believe that someone would be in my yard in the middle of a storm. As soon as he realized I had seen him, he quickly hid behind the bushes, disappearing from view. My mind raced in all directions. Who was that man? What did he want? For a moment, I tried to convince myself that it could be a lost neighbor or someone in need because of the storm, but it didn't make sense. The way he had put me on alert. I decided to lock all the doors and windows and keep watch. Time passed, and although I was still uneasy, I didn't see him again. Around 11, the wind and rain seemed to intensify even more. That's when I heard the sound I dreaded. The handle of the back window, the same window where I had seen the man, started to move, slowly, as if someone was trying to force it open. My heart raced. I ran to the window and saw a shadow moving outside. The man had returned. He was trying to open the window with both hands, fighting against the wind and rain. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to speak quietly so he wouldn't notice I was so close. As I described the situation to the operator, I watched the man stop messing with the window and, like before, quickly disappear into the trees. The wait for the police was agonizing. Every minute, I kept looking outside, expecting to see him again. The storm made everything more difficult. Every noise could have been the wind or something more sinister. When they finally arrived, the officers searched the yard and the surrounding area. But as I feared, the man had fled. Although there were no signs of forced entry and nothing was damaged, his presence was enough to keep me on edge for weeks afterward. They told me it was likely someone looking for an opportunity to steal, using the storm as cover. Even so, the feeling that he could come back didn't leave me for a long time. In the end, the man never returned. But that image of him, standing in the yard, watching, still haunts me whenever the storms return. That moment made me realize just how fragile the comfort of being safe at home can be, especially when the unknown decides to come close. That rainy night seemed perfect for staying home, away from the world. The wind was blowing hard against my apartment windows, and the raindrops fell like a steady melody. I was alone, enjoying the peace with a movie and a cup of hot tea. Living on the third floor of a building always gave me a sense of security, as if the distance from the ground separated me from the problems of the outside world. But that night, the rain brought more than the usual comfort. A little after 11 o'clock, I was pulled from my peace by knocks at the door. Firm, repetitive knocks that cut through the sound of the rain like knives. My whole body froze. I wasn't expecting anyone, and at that hour, unexpected visitors always put me on edge. I got up slowly and went to the door, my feet making as little noise as possible on the wooden floor. I looked through the peephole, trying not to make a sound. Outside, there was a man. He was completely dressed in black, his coat drenched by the rain, his wet hair sticking to his forehead. His face was tilted slightly upward, as if he knew exactly that I was there, peeking from behind the door. He didn't say anything, didn't make any gesture, just stood there waiting. My heart started to race, and a feeling of imminent danger washed over me. Why would someone be at my apartment door at this hour? Without any apparent reason, I decided to ignore him. I stepped back, trying to control my breathing, and returned to the couch. The rain outside seemed to intensify, but the knocking at the door continued for a few more minutes. It was as if he knew I was there, hiding, trying to calm down. But then, out of nowhere, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the persistent sound of the knocks. I looked at the door again, but I didn't have the courage to check if he was still there. An hour passed, maybe more, and I finally felt that the danger had passed. But then, out of pure curiosity, or perhaps an impulse I wish I'd never followed, I approached the living room window and peeked through the curtains. What I saw made me immediately recoil. There, in the building's parking lot, the man was standing. The rain was pouring down around him, but he didn't seem to care. He was still, and his eyes were fixed directly on my window, staring at the exact spot where I was. The feeling of being watched in such a direct and invasive way sent me into a panic. I hurriedly closed the curtains, my hands trembling. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I went back to the couch, but the feeling that he was still there, watching, wouldn't leave me. I looked at the clock, waiting for time to pass, hoping the storm and that man would disappear. The night dragged on, and every sound seemed more terrifying than the last. However, no matter how much my mind wanted to play tricks on me, I never heard the knocking on the door again. In the morning, when I finally had the courage to open the window, the parking lot was empty, as if the man had never been there. It was as if he had vanished with the rain. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. Maybe it was a mistake, someone who knocked on the wrong door. But the way he looked at me, the way he stood there outside, left me with a feeling I can't explain. Fortunately, he never returned, but to this day, every time a strong storm approaches, I close the curtains before the first drop falls. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out 9 scary true small town horror stories by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.